Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. My name is Alexandra Sandu. I'm the Assistant Program Director for the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's webinar entitled Liminal Urbanities of the Gulf. The Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World is a program that aims to build a platform of outstanding research relevant for the study of the Arab world from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds. The program started in 2014, and for the last 7 years, we hosted over 50 junior, mid-career, as well as senior scholars from all over the world. We have a yearly cohort of fellows of 8 to 10 scholars in residence here at NYU Abu Dhabi, who are conducting research and hosting events with fellows, faculty, and external colleagues such as this one today. We invite you to have a look at the list of our upcoming webinars, which will be shared in the chat box. This event is a wonderful example of how we see the fellowship as providing a platform for cross-disciplinary synergies with other programs, centers, as well as external institutions. We are very grateful to Professor Laure Assaf, who is Assistant Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies and Anthropology at NYU Abu Dhabi, for moderating our event today. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again at future events.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this event. So I have the great pleasure of being the moderator today, and I'll briefly introduce our 3 speakers who will each talk around 10 minutes. And in the second half of our time, we're going to move on to a discussion and Q&A session. So let me first say that today's event is intended more as a conversation in progress rather than a formal academic talk. When I met with Katia, George, and Sandra to prepare for this event, what stood out to me from our conversation was the idea that their works are tied together, not so much by a common framework, which could be applied to them, but rather by a set of questions. These questions revolve around public space in the UAE, in light of the fast-paced urban development, which started after the discovery of oil and has not ceased ever since. They also address the relations that architecture and performance entertain with this space and with the people who live in and appropriate it. So today's talk is basically an opportunity for us to get a glimpse into an ongoing conversation on these topics between 3 researchers and practitioners who approach them from distinct but interconnected fields: theater, performance, architecture, arts. I think it is through this intersection of research and practice that the title of this talk could be understood. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the liminal urbanities of the Gulf are not so much an object for the 3 of you, but rather the place where your respective works are situated and where they meet, in the interstices of urban space and at its limit, both acting upon and questioning the city and its inhabitants. And finally, I wanted to underline, as Alex has mentioned, that today's talk is also a meeting point between 2 academic institutions that are differently located in the UAE, New York University Abu Dhabi and the American University of Sharjah. So keep in mind that while this conversation is taking place online, it's also taking place across Emirates. So I will now briefly introduce each speaker in the order in which they will discuss their work. And so I'll start with Katya Alphara. Katia is an assistant professor of theater and performance studies at New York University Abu Dhabi. She's also an independent curator of performing and visual arts. She holds a PhD in art history, as well as degrees in classical studies and theater studies. She has been the theater and dance artistic director and curator of the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens during 10 years, a position in which she has initiated and curated numerous international festivals at the intersection of art, science, and civic practice, such as the Urban Fast Forward Festival. Katia is also the author. Katia is also the author of a number of essays on socially engaged art, public works, and post-documentary performance. In particular, she published in 2011 the book Théâtralité contemporaine. She edited a special issue of the journal Théâtre Public named Scène en transition, Balkans et Grèce, and she co-edited the volume Intermedial Performance and Politics in the Public Sphere in 2018. Let me move on now to who will be our second speaker, George Katodrytis. George is an architect involved in practice, teaching, and research. He is currently professor and head of the Department of Architecture at the American University of Sharjah. He has been a visiting professor at various schools around the world, and notably he studied and taught at the Architectural Association and the Bartlett in London. His work addresses the city and its evolutions in the 21st century. He employs digital technology and scripting as tools for establishing new formal and performative languages. He built a number of projects in Europe, and he also published widely on contemporary architecture, urbanism, cultural theory, and digital media. And notably, he is the co-editor of an issue of the journal Architectural Design, entitled UAE and the Gulf, Architecture and Urbanism Now. I'm now moving on to our third speaker, Sandra Peters. Sandra is an artist, writer, and educator who is currently Assistant Arts Professor of Arts Practice at New York University, Abu Dhabi. She works in sculpture, but also in a range of other media and a variety of formats, such as sound installation, moving image, film, and performance. Her art, which has been presented in several exhibitions around Europe, the USA, and the UAE, specifically engages architecture, questioning our habits of seeing, hearing, moving, and being in space. She notably worked on the architect Rudolf Schindler, producing a number of works which take inspiration from his buildings and which led her in particular to investigate the form of the cube. Sandra's work also prominently addresses our situated experience and our actual as well as imagined positions in the world. Her previous works, such as Tango or Zabriskie Point, thus have a basis in architecture while also reflecting specific cultural or historic contexts. And a comprehensive overview of her work has been published by Verlag für moderne Kunst in Vienna under the title Per Trends, Performing the Cube, Transforming the Cube. Now that you've all gotten to know our speakers a bit better, I'll give the floor to Katya Alphara to start discussing her work.
Thank you so much, Laure, for this introduction, and thank you for accepting to moderate this event tonight. I would also like to thank the Humanities Research Fellowship for the invitation. So I would like to share with you today some preliminary discussions, preliminary reflections on research that I began last year when I joined NYU Abu Dhabi on public spaces in the UAE, and specifically on public sculptures created by artist Monira Al-Qadiri. So I will start with sharing a PowerPoint with few pictures that can give you hopefully a more concrete idea of these reflections and thoughts. Okay. The interweaving of Orientalist references to traditional forms and patterns with futurist technologies and smart cities reveals the paradox of the Gulf cities, which push the limits of size, height, eccentricity, and desire to what Manuel Castells calls an overimposed postmodern monumentality. At the same time, urban public spaces, in other words, spaces that are not governed exclusively by consumption, can potentially be accessed by diverse social groups, appear to promote a sense of belonging and the production of a collective memory. Especially in the UAE in recent decades, urban public space has stood in for national and cultural identity, as manifested in heritage districts and archaeological sites, as well as public displays of dows, falcons, and other vernacular symbols of newly shaped local traditions. Tonight, I will focus my presentation on the public sculptural monuments created by Monira Al-Qadiri. I am particularly interested in the ongoing project Alien Technology, a series of large-scale public sculptures based on the heads of deep-sea oil drills. Monira dreams of installing one in every city of the Arabian Peninsula. The first public work in this series was presented in Dubai in 2014 as part of the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture Public Art Program, curated by Amanda Abi Halil. Made out of fiberglass, a widely used petroleum-based material, coated in a dark, iridescent automotive paint, and topped with a trio of spiky, crown-like forms, this public monument was installed in Dubai Sintaha Heritage District, next to pearl diving boats, as you can see here in the slide. The artist is deeply interested in the alien and alienating effect of this natural and cultural commodity in the economy, politics, everyday life, and aesthetics. Growing up in Kuwait, Al-Qadir first encountered the black liquid during the burning of the oil fields in 1991 Gulf War. The war transformed her perception of Kuwait's economy, as well as her own identity as a Kuwaiti. As a symbolic act of real-time distraction over a period of several months, this event, as she explains, made visible the fragility of economic stability and nationhood while imploding its alienating status. Al-Qadiri approaches the drill head used to extract oil as pure materiality, a substance to be seen through a formal lens. Her fabrication process assimilates the manufacturing process of the real drills. By doing so, she makes the petroleum industry tangible. Her sculptures stand in for the networks of drilling sites, pipelines, terminals, and refineries that remain invisible in cities, but that constantly change urban infrastructure. At the same time, the iridescence of alien technology, fiberglass, mimics the dichroic color not only of oil, but also of pearls. A color that stands in for multiplicity as it appears to contain multiple colors simultaneously. Since discovering iridescence, Al-Qadiri has created numerous sculptures as well as video works, performances, and installations that imagine, as she says, the traditions of a pearls and petroleum culture or a pre-oil and post-oil culture. See, here you can see the amorphous solid ghost, series of oil drill bits made of Murano glass, but also the orbit, a levitating sculpture series that quietly rotate from 2016-2017. And here you see Spectrum 1, wall mountain sculpture series. Besides this magical color, a characteristic shared by her sculptural object is that they turn the violent process of extraction towards the sky. They appear prepared to drill into outer space. The reversal of their initial earthward direction unsettles their functionality and defamiliarizes their appearance, contributing to the object's metamorphosis into something that is not easily recognizable as a drill head. Al-Qadiri new public monument, Chimera, was commissioned by Dubai Expo 2020 and its visual arts program curated by Tarek Abu El Fetou. And I would like here to thank Tarek and Monira for trusting me with this first public presentation of this project, which you can see here in a 3D rendering. Chimera is a gigantic, as you can see, monument made from aluminum, and it will be placed in the Opportunity Pavilion. Given that aluminum is a more sustainable material than the previous fiberglass, the monument is planned to remain permanently with the Expo 2020 site, a site that will be developed after the exhibition into a smart neighborhood called District 2020. Al-Qadiri Chimera takes its name from Greek mythology, a fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a god's body, and a serpent tail. Chimera, as it is in Greek, gives also her name to the latest innovation in drill technology, the extreme Chimera hybrid drill bit, optimized to drill further with higher rates of penetration. The historicity and abound futurity of Al-Qadiri dichroic color, fundamental to the cultural and economic life of the Arabian Peninsula, subverts the solid materiality of a public monument. Together with the fluidity of the mythical and technological hybrid form of Chimera, it reveals speculative counter-imaginaries of multiple past and future narratives. At the same time, these specific characteristics challenge the very notion of commemoration inherent in past and future monuments to oil in the region, such as the 4 columns of 10 meters high flame monument constructed in October 1969 in Deira to commemorate the discovery of oil in Dubai. And here you can see a picture from Sophie Therese Trenka Dalton from its current location. Or the unrealized 150-meter mastaba made of multicolored oil barrels that Christo and Jean-Claude planned for Abu Dhabi, both reflecting the so-called Islamic architecture. By aspiring to permanence, alien technology was also originally designed as a permanent sculpture, but it was destroyed when the district became a construction site. Al-Qadiri enters into dialogue with the heritage symbols that often populate roundabouts of the Gulf cities as monumental sculptures. In recent decades, the roundabouts have become more than an organizational device of modernist urban planning. They are now part of the collective memory of cities, peculiar semi-public spaces that remain visible to everyone, yet intransgressible. The monumental scale of the iconic public monuments that populate roundabouts intensifies their cultural specificity. As semi-fictionalized hyper-landmarks, these roundabouts claim a permanent place in urban social life and the semantics of tangible heritage, allowing a nation to declare who belongs to it and who does not. Al-Qadiri drill-like sculptures may not have become monuments in city roundabouts quite yet, but by landing like alien sculptures in the sterilized fabric of a heritage village and in a soon-to-be converted smart neighborhood, her sculpture actively participate in the shaping of an identity in the historically transient and impermanent architecture in Dubai. Heritage districts, sustainably developed smart neighborhoods and roundabouts could be perceived as iconic material manifestations of the ongoing historicization of the pre- and post-oil era. At the same time, Al-Qadiri's monuments deviate from their public mission and act as catalysts for unexpected encounters. Alien technology, transformative materialism echoes the concept of the liminal, the barzakh. Al-Barzakh is a Quranic word theorized by 13th century Andalusian Sufi philosopher Ibn al-Arabi as an isthmus, a liminal space between this world and the world to come, an intermediate reality that represents, according to Salman Bashir interpretation, an activity or an active entity that differentiates between two things and paradoxically, through that very act of differentiation, provides for their unity. Al-Qadiri operates in an intermediary imaginary realm of urban potentialities, where myth and history, spirituality and physicality, nature and technology coexist as the two limits that provide for the paradoxical unity of worlds. By privileging liminality over fixity, the artist escapes the hegemonic discourse on historical and cultural specificity, or in other words, escapes contemporaneity. In Monir al-Qadiri fluid materialism, a future that has already arrived coexists with a world that has already passed. The very condition of historical activity, or the agency to make or unmake history, lies in these unconformities of time. Herself the grandchild of a singer on a pearl diving boat, the artist reclaims in her public works the right to an anti-essentialist identity. Through the transformative potential of color and shape, Al-Qadiri imagines the spectral return of the pearl and oil laborers from the deep sea to a common space of constant negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katia. We'll now move on to George.
Thank you. Share the screen. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to participate to the Liminal Urbanities event. It is a privilege to do so with Katia and Sandra, with whom in the past few months have been working together to critically explore the definition and transformation of common spaces in the UAE and the Gulf. My brief presentation and discussion will focus on new emerging realities of the Gulf city. This will be done by starting from the ideal, moving to the real, and then to the imaginary, exploring challenges and new ways to reevaluate, participate, and interfere with the city. This journey will start from the center, what I call the pandemic agoraphobic center, and move to the idiosyncratic periphery, and in doing so, project a possible new imaginary. Starting from the city of chunks, the master plan of Dubai by Harris, 1959. Everyone knows about it by now, a very historic moment in the urban and architectural development of the UAE. The city expanded fast outwards, leaving chunks of space as fragments put together by virtue of proximity. An ideal plan in its original state, but in its realization allows for no cohesion and very little layering. Any reading of a public space is only incidental. Whatever is left is always in between. Paradoxically, 60 years later, history repeats itself. The current fear of the public forces real estate values to shift city dwellers to the outskirts. Some of my presentation will include some work by students, and these are some of them. The Gulf city centers as places of street trading and production, and therefore of shared social spaces, like in this map, are now becoming almost inaccessible. These spaces need to be rethought and redesigned. The unsettling qualities of the center have become more mysterious and uncanny. The anxiety of the urban cannot be disregarded. The city epicenter is transformed to areas of epidemic and defensive territories that have made existing divisions even larger into large voids. There is a new medical and biology reality in the city. Public space is not available for all anymore, or maybe it's not desirable by all anymore. Is this the ultimate end of this space? What is next? This is a new form of agoraphobia. Agoraphobia, in its simplest form, is the fear of public space. If the center is to be feared and physicality is only measured in terms of distance, there's no other escape than suburbia, I claim. And now moving to the next part of my presentation, hospital garden or the prison mall. There's a convenience in reaching out to idiosyncratic suburbias, like a new form of fantasy, which has been happening in the UAE in the last maybe 30 years. The outskirts is the place of anything is possible. The Gulf city of chunks, of monumental spaceships and other oriental imageries, it's now moving paradoxically to the periphery. This is where the landscape of the new center will be found. The desert, the park, the mall, and the hospital garden. And with it, maybe a revised post-colonial imagery, usually of lazy lifestyles and well-behaved residents. And what is left behind, parts of the city, of what is left of it, could resemble a factory of invisible networks, distributions, and remote operations. This is a very dystopian vision of the city. There is no proximity or sense of location. Everybody have moved to the periphery. What is left? Urban centers are becoming infrastructures for distant and online trading exclusively. There is no diversity. But something interesting is coming out of this. And this is a series of images. The three next images is part of the OMA's recent research on health and hospitals. It's a really fascinating research about the future of health, architecture, health, and hospitals. Where now the new center will be the periphery. And this allows the whole city, maybe surrounded by huge billboards, to become a destination for health recovery, isolation, and health lifestyles. But also, social space turns into a fetishized abstraction. The cathartic imagery allows for hygienic lifestyle, away from the distractions and, to some extent, the filthiness of modern urban life and congested public spaces, towards exclusive, endless, controlled spaces. Maybe a new form of hospitals, friendly environments, and even shopping malls. These will become areas of a new type of production, of healthy living, and also utopia. These will become a form of new healing machines. But there's also, again, something interesting potentially coming out of this projected imaginary. Despite the melancholy of abandoning the center of the city, that is, to arrive to nowhere, in other words, to arrive to a new public space, which is suburbia. The escape to suburbia brings inevitably a new and emerging form of expression and language, materiality, and set of codes, possibly a new playground for tectonic possibilities. Yet this is where nature and ecosystems, maybe for the first time, offer experiments and explorations in nature, natural materials, and processes, but also with a combination of new technologies. And so from the aging tactility of the traditional center, which has been abandoned, to the pastiche materiality of the periphery, which is the projected imagery, this could be the setting of the new city. This is a different expression of Orientalism, not the Orientalism that we knew so far. It is local this time, and also it doesn't look Oriental. Performative materials, intelligent materials, in other words, architecture that adapts, and the environment as an agency is where the new experimentation will take place. Architecture thus becomes part of a complex system of ecology and biology. This materiality is made by hybrid objects, both synthetic and natural. The method involves an environmental understanding of landscape, but also a true understanding of sustainability. And finally, only after then, reclaiming large and arid areas and weaving the outer periphery, the desert, the park, the mall, and the hospital become new expressions, new centers, and possibly new common spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And we move on to our third speaker, Sandra Peters.
You are muted.
Okay, now I should be here. Good, sorry for that. Okay, again, thank you, Laure, for the kind introduction. And thank you very much to NYUAD Humanities Research Fellowship to invite us, the three of us today, and to give us the floor to present our work, but also to have the chance to engage with a larger public, which is virtual right now. So I'm an artist, as Laure was introducing me. I do sculptures, and my work is related to architecture, and especially to the site where I'm living and where I'm, working, which is now the UAE. And I'm going to present, or I'm going to read and present a work that I began to design and plan in 2019, which is not realized, which is still in kind of a progress. And I decided, because 10 minutes are pass very quickly, I'm going to read from a larger paper 2 paragraphs to give you a overview or some insights into this work. The work is called City Center Nomadic Monads. With City Center Nomadic Monads, I respond to requirements and challenges that relate to the category of public outdoor sculpture. My project draws on the contemporary design and experience of urban space. It does so in relation to conditions and developments that are specific to the UAE. In my work as a visual artist, I'm concerned with architecture and urban space and on the reciprocal relationships and influences that exist between people and architecture. I'm committed to creating spaces that stimulate reflection on the cultural structures within which we move and render them experientially accessible in aesthetic terms. I plan to create 5 columns based on various geometric layouts: hexagon, pentagon, triangle, square, and circle. You can see them here presented as Photoshop images. And the columns will be fabricated in 2-way mirror glass. The approximate diameter of each sculpture will be 120 centimeters and the height around 324 centimeters. Viewers perceive not just mirror reflections of themselves and their surroundings, but can also, depending upon the incident light, see through the columns themselves. In relation to the respective geometric forms, the reflective surfaces generate multiple reflections which, depending upon light conditions, pass from the interior of the stylus into the exterior space. The installation will be placed in a dispersed manner in the outer area of Morea Square in Sharjah, part of the Sharjah Art Foundation. When visitors stroll across the labyrinthine area of the square, they will encounter the 5 columns at various locations. No column will be visible simultaneously with any other, yet visitors will recall which ones they have seen and where. They are conceived as a mobile group. The material and the aesthetic of these glass sculptures allude to the new high-rise architecture that defines parts of the urban skyline in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and characterizes core areas of both cities. The cities of the UAE are in the state of constant development, and the columns address pedestrian observers in their changing relationship to one another and to their urban surroundings. In this instance, the columns serve both as sculptures that relate to the bodies and perspectives of the beholders and as a folding of the urban landscape onto itself. I'm interested in the development of urban space in the UAE and in the current and future influence exercised by architects from a range of cultural backgrounds. Manifested in the built environment is the historically evolved self-understanding of the community. An outdoor sculpture relates to its urban surroundings. It addresses a public by referring to an established self-understanding. In my exploratory walks in Abu Dhabi, I encountered a recurrent architectural element that manifests an affinity with sculpture to the extent that it lacks any recognizable architectural function. A column that is clad in reflective chrome sheet. Such columns as semicircular elements set in front of building facades are found constantly in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere in the UAE, often in close proximity to the entry areas of buildings, either outside or inside, but visible from the outside or as an element that structures the facade. I noticed that this element often occurs singly, but also in pairs or serial arrangements. To be sure, it functions as a decorative element, but in contrast to most of the decorative elements used for buildings in the UAE, no specifically Arab provenance is detectable. Its significance must be sought elsewhere. The question then arose of whether this element was found outside of the UAE, and if so, where. Through my research, I discovered that in the US during the 70s, in particular in New York, large building complexes were erected, including hotels, malls, gymnasiums, and recreational facilities that made it virtually superfluous to enter public space. Frequently found in such buildings, astonishingly, is the column in mirror chrome, as you can see here in the former Gem Court building in Manhattan. When we consider that the interior of a building complex conveys no information about where the structure sits within the urban landscape, and that there's no necessity to enter the outside space, it becomes apparent that the function of the mirrored chrome's column is to suggest a city center position rhetorically for the building within which the visitor finds her or himself, and where she or he may wonder where he or she actually is. In Abu Dhabi, the mirror chrome column was introduced as an architectural element around the same time it appeared in the US. There is no reason to assume either in the US or in the UAE that it was already familiar from its usage elsewhere. Instead, it appears that the way in which this element is handled in the UAE differs entirely from its use in the US. There, the mirrored chrome column is found exclusively in the interiors of publicly accessible buildings. In the UAE, in contrast, is found primarily in association with the entry areas of facades. This does not exclude the possibility that the fundamental rhetorical function is similar, but suggests that these divergent urbanistic situations, this function is fulfilled differently using the same element. This becomes easy to understand when we recall that two-way mirror glass was introduced into high-rise architecture during the 70s. Two-way mirror glass has ambivalent connotations. On the one hand, it is regarded as ecologically efficient since it can be used to optimize energy management. On the other, facade in two-way mirror glass may convey the impression of a shielding effect from the outside, since it becomes impossible to see inside the building from the outside, although the outside is visible from within. Unavoidably, this raises the notion of potential surveillance, at least once the presence of a genuine outside threat has been detected. The rate of criminality was extremely high in New York City of the 1970s, which was also why public life retreated increasingly into the interior of building complexes. The situation in the UAE was very different. The introduction to two-way mirror glass was an ecological necessity and was accompanied by the futuristic design of many new buildings, which are not interpretable as threat responses. While in New York, one readily has a sense of where the downtown is located, this is not the case, or at least not with such clarity, in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. The element of the mirrored chrome column used to ornament building facades is encountered at urban locations that can hardly be regarded as central. It is therefore worthwhile to define the rhetorical and psychological function of this element more precisely. It must be asked, what role is played with a circular or semicircular cross-section of this element? Playing a role here, doubtless, is the circumstance that a mirror chrome column absorbs the entire surrounding into itself, optically centering it, including the beholder and passerby, at the same time reflecting the entire environment. Unlike a planar mirror, our gaze into the reflective surface provides no information about our position. Addressed instead is the imagination of the beholder, and in such a way that the desire to imagine a centering is linked to the simultaneous desire to expand an existing situation in the imagination unhindered. The imagination is simultaneously oriented, centripetal, relation to an origin, and centrifugal, in relation to endless possibilities. My sculpture project refers to this situation, both abstractly as well as concretely. It is an ancient idea that the question of origin can be related to number. The Pythagoreans referred to the divine origin of the cosmos as a monad. Emerging from it is the duad, from which further numbers follow, which give the rise to bodies and finally to the four elements, fire, water, earth, air, of which the world consists. The monad is symbolized by the circle. The circular chrome mirrored column corresponds to this. All polygons refer ultimately to the circle, which has no corners and hence has precedence at the first element, as well as the zero element, which is nonetheless divisible. Each succeeding element is centered in itself and hence similar to the circle. My sculpture project relates to factors which, as a rule, in a finely unconscious way, make the mirrored chrome column an architectural element that is as popular as it is functional. 5 freestanding columns whose cross sections are formed by geometric figures. The circle, the triangle, the square, the pentagon, and the hexagon are fabricated from two-way mirror glass and can be set up in a variable way in a variety of urban environments. They address the desire to see the urban surroundings reflected and hence to experience a centripetal and centrifugal orientation simultaneously. As a mobile group, it is a question of nomadic monads. They bring something into play that is fundamental to the concept of modernity, but without, however, being specific to modernity. The experience of a culture that finds itself in a state of transition and which must come to terms with this situation. As it is at this fundamental level that an affinity is identified between the term modernity and the nomadic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And thank you all to the three of you for these very engaging perspectives. So I would like to invite the audience to write down your questions in the Q&A box. And Katia and George, you can turn your video back on so that we can start the discussion. So to start off with the discussion, I would like to ask a question that I see as sort of transversal to all of your presentation. And that is also, I think, a particularly salient question for anyone working on the Gulf region, which is the relation between the materiality of urban space and its images. There is a very common trope in existing academic literature on the Gulf, which is to build a binary opposition between the materiality and the imagery of the city. I'm thinking in particular of Mike Davis's famous or infamous essay, and its critique by Shomon Bassar, for example. And just for those who might not be familiar with it, Davis's essay is basically a critique of Dubai that is based around the idea that the skyline or the urban developments are shiny images that hide the reality of economic exploitation happening behind the scenes. To which Bassar responds that Davis also takes the fantasy for a reality and basically sort of confuses the urban imagery with the city itself and sort of ignores the life that actually happens in Dubai. And I think all of your presentations sort of connect in interesting ways with this binary or challenge it in interesting ways. The works of Monira al-Kabiri that were analyzed by Katia sort of make a visible or monumental form of a force, oil, that invisibly shapes urban space, right, or that contributes to this urban development. And at the same time, I found it very fascinating that she's labeling them ghosts, aliens, spectra, chimeras, so immaterial entities in a sense. Georgie's talk articulated this binary more directly by showing how the pandemic sort of reversed usual images of the city, or rather throw back the elements of the development or of the urban spectacle into an imagery that becomes less and less desirable as we move towards a more sustainable vision of the city. And Sandra's work also questions the moments when the city sort of inadvertently mirrors itself in a sense, and I think your work, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of proposes to do this consciously, right, or to interrogate this consciously. And so I would be curious to hear further, to hear more about your thoughts on this question and to elaborate on how your work addresses and maybe challenges this, this question of materiality and imagery of the city.
Yeah, if I may ask, just I may start very briefly. It's interesting you refer to the issue of materiality versus the imagery of the Gulf city, and at times it's taken, the imagery is taken as a form of critique, and materiality also in that sense. And it's interesting to see also Katia's and Sandra's work that deal with the issue of the fiberglass or the aluminum structure or the mirror chrome, depicting layers of the city as such. I think at the end of the day, it's more complex, I think, this question, and also the reality that I think all forms of materiality exist in the image. It's a question how much and how close one encounters it. So if you see the image of the city is sleek, and it's interesting to hear Sandra's kind of critique and also celebration of the sleekness, and I think Katia's reference to monumentality as structures that can exist in roundabouts and so on. But in close encounters, and it's something also that I was looking, the flip side or the back street, it's full of everyday materiality, and even the kind of the sleek image has a flip side of it, which is extremely interesting. It's kind of ugly in a way, but extremely interesting. So the city is more complex than we try to depict it, or at least criticize it. And I think that came through all three presentations. And it's a question of how far one chooses to engage with this trilogy, if you like, of materiality: the imagery, the kind of sleek materiality, and the kind of raw materiality, and so on. In my position, as you rightly use the word, the pandemic is reversing the reading of the city away from the center. And it's exactly that we're losing sense of real materiality by moving to the outside because of the pandemic. But by doing that, a new form of materiality, maybe a new imaginary materiality, needs to restart again, and a new form of orientalism needs to restart again. It's inevitable that we have to engage in all these layers, if you like, of experience.
Go ahead, Sandra. You're muted. Sandra, you are muted.
I'm so sorry. Okay, here I am. I really like the comment from George, and I think this, let's say, the imagery, or let's say the postcard view, or whatever, however you would like to put it. But then there is, especially again, I mean, I do a lot of walking in the city, and that is kind of, let's say, my direct approach to explore the city and to understand the city. There are so many, let's say, unplanned spaces. For example, the Sikas, here also in the downtown area in Abu Dhabi, and these kind of unplanned areas where people almost like take over and create, let's say, their public space is quite interesting, because these are really non-designed spaces, and they are really the opposite in terms of materiality, in terms of, you know, like you would not use this as an image to advertise, you know, any of these cities, but they are real spaces, and that is really interesting. Also, yeah, I think to add towards what George was saying.
And yeah, I would like also to, yes, to add that perhaps it's a question also between representation and materiality, how a city is represented, this representationality. And what I was interested actually in the reason why my research led me to Monira's work is that her work is also actually trying somehow to go beyond, to overcome this kind of binaries, and this notion of the fluid materialism, or the common, more well-known notion of new materialism, somehow unsettle this kind of differentiation, because it includes not only materiality in a more, let's say, literal sense, but also, you know, senses and bodies is a kind of embodied materialism, I could say even. So yeah, I think that it's interesting now to go beyond this kind of rhetoric and see how perhaps with the tools of art and artistic gestures we can perhaps, you know, rethink the way that we speak about the Gulf cities today.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and maybe to come back to Sandra's comment, I think there's also the fact that, I mean, what you pointed to, which is really interesting to me as someone who has been working in urban anthropology on the Gulf, is that it is, or what is often insisted on, is this top-down dimension of urban development, but what is less often addressed is that precisely this top-down development creates a lot of liminality, or that liminality also surfaces in the interstices of this space. The three of you also addressed quite a lot the notion of public space, and I would like to come back on this maybe for the few minutes we have left, because this goes hand in hand also with another dominant theme of urban studies in the region, which is the question of the segregation of urban populations in Gulf cities. And public space is often, sometimes maybe wrongly, conflated with the public sphere in the Habermas sense, which also raises the question of which public is constituted. And so I feel that this is a particularly important question in a place where urban populations are characterized by a huge diversity in terms of national and ethnic origins, of religious affiliations, of linguistic practices, but also a place where this diversity overlaps with and translates into many economic, social, racial, and gender inequalities. And so this makes it, I think, particularly difficult here, although it should be difficult everywhere, to think of the public as a homogeneous collective. And I would really love to hear how your work and the processes you are looking at through your work engage this question of the public and this question of which public are we talking about. Sandra, you can.
Yeah, I think it's a very it's not so easy to respond, because I think there's so many different definitions and ideas about what a public space is. And when I think about it, I think, let's say, a place or a public space, or a place that allows people to come together, but different groups of people to come together and spend time there, I'm just thinking about, let's say, the family park, which is around my neighborhood. And I'm always amazed when I go there to see all these kind of different groups coming together, sitting there, spending their afternoon there, eating there, creating picnic, children going around. But it's not that this is one, let's say, one population or one group that lives in Abu Dhabi. It's really different nationalities and different groups of people. And for me, this is a successful example as a public space where people feel comfortable to spend time together, but without knowing each other. Of course, there are little groups and they know each other, but there is a public situation. And I think that would be my definition of a public space that works.
Thank you, Katia.
Yeah, just a short comment on that. I think that the notion of the public space, of course, as we discussed here, and as so many scholars also, research already, is very different here in the Gulf than, for example, in Europe. I mean, there is a lot of focus, I think, in the notion of the sanitized public space, of the public space within the malls, for example, and of course, as a kind of differentiation with the informal spaces in this kind of terrain vagues in the city. But I think what is interesting, perhaps, to reflect is how and if these kind of barriers and exclusions can be rethink, and if the artistic work again can somehow contribute to this kind of blurring of boundaries. And for me, the roundabouts, for example, are very exemplary on this as a kind of typology of these public spaces, because it's something which is a semi-public space, but at the same time, the workers who are working there to preserve the roundabouts are there. And of course, have multiple examples of the importance that these roundabouts have for the national production of space. So I think that, yeah, I mean, we can perhaps think this kind of multiplicity of publics, a multiplicity of users of a public space that are not, just separating the users by, tourism or expats from let's say, local public or local users. Yeah.
And I think maybe in the UAE there's and we haven't found a word to describe it yet. I think there's a new definition. There should be a new definition of what the conventional understanding of a public space is, which is, I guess for me, is the Italian piazza, and you sit in the middle, and you look around, there's a spectacle, and so on. If that is the notion of the public space, the kind of collective, open area in a city where different people of mix and so on, I don't think we have any in the UAE in that definition. So I think one needs to, in terms of the semantics and terminology, we need to look at other ways of imagining what a public space is. And I think maybe one might begin to look at the production of a space, the infrastructure space, the transportation space, the shopping space, spontaneous operations that happen in the city. And they're highly segregated, as you have mentioned, because they only operate within a specific intention and use. It's kind of utilitarian in a way. And in that sense, they're really interesting. In a way, they are functional spaces as opposed to leisure spaces, because I see them as spaces of production, mainly infrastructure that we encounter every day in the city. And the big question now is, if the utility and if the understanding of the public space is one of a collective gathering, given the current pandemic, how would these spaces now be designed, and how do we visualize them to be used? And I think that's a critical way of looking at a space which is not going to be functional anymore as we expect it to be. And I think that's really interesting. Now, whether there will be abandoned or whether they will be highly specialized in terms of transportation, utility, storage, or shopping, that's something to be seen. I think that's an outcome of the kind of medical situation that we're going through. And even if this pandemic is over, one day it will be, I don't think we'll go back to what we used to before, because there will be a new way, I think, of looking, and also still a little bit of the fear of being in a very crowded, tiny space in the city, unless there's a specific maybe utility purpose for this.
Thank you very much. As an anthropologist, I have to say that the idea that we should build a new definition of public spaces in the Gulf through their uses and through looking at how uses sort of always bypass and go beyond the intentional functions of space is something that I really fully agree with. We are slightly over time, but we've been gently allowed to go a few minutes longer. So I'm just going to read you one comment that is in the Q&A, and there's one question for George as well. So there's one comment by Sophie Therese Trenka-Dalton to Sandra's contribution that is saying that the family parks in the UAE usually exclude the bachelor, so men or groups of men without a family. And I just also ask the question for George, and then I can let both of you answer. So George, you have a question from Joanna Settle asking, I wonder if your research into the decentering of the city has moved into questioning how shifting the containers for our lives and leisure, changing the forms those activities take, might affect our bodies. And is that already happening? Sandra, you can start.
Can you reread my question? I was not. Can you just say it again? What is it?
It was actually more of a comment, just adding that the family parks usually exclude the bachelors, and so family usually is actually sort of an exclusive term that that excludes men or groups of men who are not coming with a family.
Oh, okay. I'm not. I don't know. It's good. I mean, thank you for mentioning this. When I do my next walk, I will have an eye open and we'll see if I see bachelors or not. And I'm happy to report them back. What I have observed just is really that it's incredibly diverse in this particular park, and that it's not. I mean, it's really very, very crowded and a very unusual situation. But I double check. I double check, which groups are actually there, and I try to be. I will get back to you. Just let's put it like this. Thank you.
I think there's also a difference between the public parks and the family parks, who usually have a paying entrance and that are more a bit like the family beach and public beach are distinct also. George, do you want to reply to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's interesting to think about how emotionally we're attaching to a city because of the encounters. I think we tend to be romantic when it comes to talk about the imagery of the public space of the city. There's a kind of social component, spontaneous, and so on. And if now there's a tendency to decentralize that and kind of move to shipping containers, which sounds like a horrible idea, but it's happening already in the sense that it's kind of 60s, 70s idea of metabolism that you design one module, Japanese metabolism and other experiments also in Europe and in Canada in the 70s. The hygienic module is almost like a hospital ward, like a hospital room, which has all the amenities and all the safeties and all the infrastructures necessary. And that's enough as a basic dwelling unit. And then we begin to organize the city horizontally or vertically. Vertically is happening now, you know, these high rises, they have like a kind of the plug-in kind of quality, the mechanization, and whether that will become a form of structuring our cities and the empty spaces and the public spaces, this kind of aggregate of units, almost like a port or an airport or a factory, as I mentioned. I think it's going to be disappointing, but because we lose the emotional contact with space, we just become a number among a bigger system of iterations. But I think inevitably we're moving into that direction because it's hygienic, it can be controlled easily, it can be reorganized easily, and so on. So as much as we lose, as I said, the romantic meandering of the city, will become like living in big airports where everything is based on a number and a kind of multiplicity of a system as opposed to a kind of individuality. And I think under the current circumstances of safety and health, we become almost like hospitalized in the way we perceive our space for living and urban environment as well.
Thank you very much, Katia.
And just to add to this comment by George, that I'm thinking that even the smart cities today, the smart neighborhoods, let's say, somehow seem to reappropriate this model of a neighbor that was before the modernization of the cities here. So before we become used to move around with a car, but nevertheless, this kind of new neighborhoods that are designed like the Masdar city or the upcoming the District 2020 that have all the characteristics, let's say, of a neighborhood. I mean, with a piazza, for example, where all people can gathering, a lot of public artworks, nevertheless are highly surveyed. So there is a big question how this kind of new model that seems that looks towards this post-oil era or post-car era, how perhaps can become kind of public spaces, heterogeneous public spaces, and without excluding, people who are not inhabitants and things like that. I think it's. I'm afraid that now with this pandemic situation, these issues of surveillance will be perhaps rediscussed. And let's hope that perhaps we will find somehow, perhaps by kind of horizontal spatial organization that can challenge the vertical organization of the city. Perhaps we can find in the future this common space that George also was mentioning in his talk, and I also was, aspiring to in my reflection on the public monuments.
Thank you very much, Katia, for this slightly more optimistic conclusion. So maybe we can stay on this, and thank you to the three of you for this great talk. And thank you very much to all of our attendees and to the Humanities Research Fellowship for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Laure. Thank you, Sandra and George. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending.